record to this computer. Come on, internet. I have clear audio because I phone in, so if my computer video slows down, I'm still here.
Okay.
Maybe I'm going to record to my computer just so that, or do you have easy recording access?
I don't from your computer, but if you record your computer and if you record to the cloud, I think I can retrieve it as well as you can.
Okay.
Because I like to post these fairly quickly, and I'm going to send a link to a couple of people.
Perfect. I'm going to hit broadcast. We are recording to the cloud.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Are we ready to go?
Broadcast hasn't clicked off yet. Thinking about it. There we go. We are now broadcasting.
All right. Welcome, everybody, to another delightful edition of live interviews. And it's kind of an ironic twist today that it's my absolute pleasure. It's not ironic that it's my pleasure, but it's ironic that I have the pleasure of interviewing and asking questions of Robin Zander, who is the person who I am collaborating with on these series of interviews. For those of you who are not familiar with Robin, Robin, I'm going to let you just start by introducing yourself. You are truly a Renaissance man. You have lived more lifetimes in your short life than many of the people I know. So tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to be involved with responsive.org.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, very much a pleasure to be here, and fun to have participants. I see folks joining even as we speak. I like the idea of a Renaissance man. I don't know that I perhaps qualified, but that is a lifetime goal of mine, to live an interesting life or live interesting lives. And it definitely feels like I've had several to date. As a tangent, but something funny that came up yesterday, my mother and I are taking a month-long trip after Responsive Conference, which of course we'll talk about, to Ghana for the month of October. It's just she and I traveling together. And we were filling out visas yesterday, and she asked me, what is your profession? And I said, professional dilettante. And she adamantly refused to write down professional dilettante on my visa. But that is, like, I feel like I continually stumble from one project to the next and put a lot of work in and a lot of effort, and sometimes we see the fruits of those labors.
And some of the things people who don't know you may not be aware of. I don't want to go too far on this, but you were part of a circus for a while. You had a coffee shop. You run Zander Media.
Yeah.
Any of those experiences, let me re-ask that question. Have any of those experiences markedly shaped the work that you're doing now?
Oh, all of them. So yeah, I have often said I've worked in everything from circus performance to management consulting and back again. And I've worked in probably 30 different industries in the last 15 years. And they all influence, right? And more than what they have difference is what they have in common. So for example, over the last 3 years, up until last November, I built and then eventually sold a cafe, Robin's Cafe, which still exists. My old manager is still the manager behind the counter in the Mission District in San Francisco. And the thing that's really interesting about building a coffee shop and a restaurant in San Francisco is not what it has separate from, a global company like PepsiCo or Airbnb, but what it has in common, right? So when I think about the future of work, when I think about the responsive org movement, which is why we're here, it's the human problems that every organization, whether it's two people hacking away on a project in a garage or the biggest multinationals in the world, struggle with more similarities of problems than differences.
And I'm going to ask you to highlight a couple of those problems that you have observed as they relate to the responsive community, to the responsive conference, which we'll jump into in a few minutes.
For sure.
But what are some of those themes, and how do you see them playing out in the responsive community?
Oh, there's so many, and there's sort of the very tactical. So, you know, we're on a video call. The conversation around remote work and distributed workforces and distributed teams has evolved substantially in just the last couple of years. A theme that we're leaning into really heavily at Responsive Conference 2019 is parenthood at work, and how to really bring these aspects of personal life that are usually very private into an environment where work can actually support the full human. But then there's things that are a little bit harder to talk about, and that really brought you and I together to begin with, Glenn, you know, more than a year ago, which is stuff around human development and like getting to the truth of an individual. So remote work, parenthood at work, the gig economy, AI, right? All of these, you know, even the technology we use, Zoom video or Slack or email, for God's sakes, are very tactical. And there's a whole lot there that really impact our day-to-day lives, and simple changes. For me, in email, it seems so basic, but I use an app called Boomerang, which helps me remember when to follow up with people. Because I found that in digital or analog life, just the ability to follow up with somebody consistently when I've said I was going to is 75, 80% of the battle in moving any project forward personally or professionally. But then we can hop over to, you know, the non-tactical, which is to say, in some ways, to my mind, the emotional side, right? And this is where I find that the life experiences and professional experiences I've had and been privileged to have the biggest impact, right? So I worked for 5 years with kids with autism and their families all over the world. And what I found, the reason I was interested in working with kids with special needs is that their parents have such an incredible growth trajectory ahead of them that they have to go through in order to help their children, and that they're motivated by that emotional growth to, not for themselves as a parent, but for their children, right? And I look at those parents, and then I look at the most sophisticated leaders of organizations around the world that I've had the privilege to meet, Stan McChrystal and Chris Fussell of the McChrystal Group and the best-selling book Team of Teams, or Simon Loudon, my friend who is also the president of Pepsi Global Snacks and a real big responsive advocate for responsive practices at Pepsi. These, in this case, men, but there's you know, dozens of them I could list, are some of the most sophisticated thinkers and emotionally thoughtful humans that I've ever had the privilege of sitting down with. And so whether you're talking about a special needs parent or the leader of a global organization, they've done the internal work that is not about a sophisticated note-taking system or a Gmail app, but it's about who are you, what is your purpose, and how do you take that purpose forward that makes a really big difference. And so for me, the future of work, building an organization, and for me, the organizations that I strive to build or be a part of, nurture the whole human and help each person within the company take that next step in their own emotional development.
I don't want to get too tangential on metaphors here, but I was reflecting when you were talking about the similarities, CEOs and parents of autistic kids. And there really is this communication and this gap that has to be bridged, because most of the innovative CEOs you and I have worked with are so visionary that they have to bring this down to a practical level for everyday people who just want to go to work. Take a few minutes. I've asked you this question before, and I imagine the answer is an evolving response. For those that are somewhat new to the responsive community, terms such as responsive and agile and lean all get used interchangeably. Sometimes they have meaning, sometimes they don't. What is your current thinking about responsive, that term itself, and how it plays out?
So yeah, it's a good question. it's semantics ultimately, right? Like, yes, I wrote a book called Responsive, What Does It Take to Create a Thriving Organization? I run a conference called Responsive Conference, but ultimately I don't care what word we're using if people love their work. And I really don't care what word we're using if people hate their work, right? Like, it's not about the words we use, it's about the tactics and also the fundamental human nature of the humans who are actually working within organizations. So there are so many, right? Teal, Agile, Lean, Beyond Budgeting, Holacracy, Team of Teams, right? Like, the list is very nearly endless. The reason that when I was first exposed to the responsive org movement in 2014 that I got really interested is that responsive is not pedagogical. It is not teaching people that if you just adopt steps 1, 2, and 3, you're going to have a successful company and great evolved humans and your problems are going to be solved. When I read the Responsive Org Manifesto, which, to be clear, I did not write, but was maybe an enthusiastic adopter of in 2014, I like it because it's not teaching me the steps. It's outlaying some of the problems. It's saying, how do we balance the need that every organization, frankly, every person has to strike between profit and purpose? How do we balance between transparency and privacy, right? And we're seeing these things play out in the world today. This was written before the Me Too movement, before D&I was a common acronym that sort of most people could read the New York Times and say, oh, D&I, that means diversity and inclusion. And yet the founders behind Responsive Org said there's a need to describe these tensions, these tensions that have to be balanced between extremes. We're no longer living in a world, if we were ever, where the sole motive for organizations is profit. But I've run nonprofits and for-profits, and even with a nonprofit, you still have to attend to the bottom line of the organization, or eventually the organization will cease to exist.
So let me just interrupt for a moment, Robin. You referred to the Responsive Manifesto. For those who have not looked at it or are not familiar, the manifesto is highlighted on the responsive.org website. So if you go to responsive.org and just scroll through, you will see the manifesto. I think it's a brilliant piece, and I think it articulates many of the current challenges. And also for those who are listening in, if you have any questions or any comments you'd like to offer, you can use the chat room or the question and answer. Robin, let's segue a bit into the Responsive Conference. And again, just for our listening audience, there's responsive.org, which we'll go into a little bit more. The Responsive Conference is your baby, so to speak. We have one coming up in less than 2 weeks. Is this the 4th one?
This is the 4th, exactly.
And this will be held to provide a little information about what
people
can look forward to.
So when I was exposed to responsive.org, the manifesto and the movement, it was a going concern globally in 2013 and 2014. It was written by 6 different folks: Adam Pisoni, the co-founder of Yammer, Steve Hopkins, who's at Culture Amp, Alexis Gonzalez-Black, who helped to roll out Holacracy at Zappos. These 6 different folks from all over the world wrote the manifesto with support from their networks and gave it to the community. When I came into the conversation, each of them had sort of moved on to their next thing. Adam had sold Yammer, Alexis had left Zappos for IDEO, et cetera. And nobody was doing simple things like updating the responsive.org website. Even so, there remains a global community, right? Folks listening are very much a part of it from all over the world, getting together for unconferences, for meetups, for responsive coffees, to talk about these principles and these ideas. I asked a friend, Steve Hopkins, one of the co-authors. He was somebody I had met, and I read the manifesto and said, hey, I'd like to help. This really strikes a chord with me. I have a pretty eclectic background, and some of these trends really thread through all of my life and work experience. What can I do to help? And he said, I think you should run an unconference. And I said, great, what's an unconference? And he described an event that is essentially determined by the people who show up in the room, where, there's, as the organizer, I would invite a lot of people, sell tickets, or in that case, it was free to attend. But the people who show up determine the subject matters that we're there to explore. And so in early 2016, along with a few folks in San Francisco, I put on the very first, or at least my very first responsive org unconference. It was the day before Valentine's Day. It was a rainy Saturday in downtown San Francisco, and I had very low expectations. I was expecting 20 or 30 people to show up. We had 200. We had to turn people away at the door. And the energy in that room was just dynamic. We had folks from a holacracy-run community kitchen called Three Stone Hearth, sitting down and debating compensation strategies with the head of recruiting at Google, right? Like folks from a wide variety of different industries talking about really like heady and sensitive topics. And I remember that specific conversation. We had an hour set aside for it. And at the end of the hour, they were like, no, we're not done. We're staying here and we're hashing it out. And so it was the energy that day that to me was like, wow, I've never run an event before. And there's clearly legs here. There's clearly need for more. I wonder if this community could use something even bigger. And so I went to the founders of Responsive Org and said, hey, I think that there's need for a global meetup, something that's not just, that was San Francisco based, but we had folks flying down from Seattle and driving up from LA. I want to build something globally for the Responsive Org movement to come together in person, because there's so much power when you gather people together in the same location. So again, with no event experience, I ran my very first Responsive conference in September of 2016. And got very fortunate, right? We had Chris Fussell, who I mentioned, the co-author of Team of Teens, on stage, Jen Denard, the then head of people at Medium, on stage. I sat down with Joel Gascoigne, the CEO of Buffer, which was at the time widely known as an entirely remote company, one of the few at that time. And ridiculous things, right? As I was about to introduce one of our opening keynotes, I got a tap on the shoulder from one of my volunteers and said, they said, there's this guy, he says his name is Tony, he's at the front door. And it turned out it was the CEO of Zappos, Tony Hsieh, and a contingent of, his peers, his friends from Zappos, coming not to speak, but to attend. And so, yeah, Responsive Conference took off. That first one was a 2-day. We then moved to New York because I wanted a little bit more of a global reach and to be more accessible to a global audience traveling from outside the US. And so we were in Queens, New York the last 2 years. And then Tony Hsieh turned around and invited us to run it on Zappos campus in 2019. So it's coming up.
So before we get into the specifics of this, I'm going to give a commercial pitch for the conference. I was at the first one last year in New York. And one of the things that I was struck by, and it comes back to your verbiage of an unconference, because I've been through tons and tons of conferences. One of the things that I absolutely appreciated was how much community was built in. How this is not the type of conference where we use, to borrow somebody else's phrase, of the sage from the stage. There are some dynamic, terrific keynote speakers, but so much of the experience is designed around interacting with peers, interacting with people who have the same questions that I have. A lot of small group dynamics and time built in. And kudos to you, Robin, for the way that even the dinner was set up, because so many conferences are set up where people are going, who do I connect to and how do I connect? And that became such a seamless activity. So tell us a little bit about this one. This is going to be different. It's in a new location. It's going to be larger audience.
I think, I don't know. When I think about this conversation, there's two themes that come to mind. One is, right, like the future of work is doing things that we don't know how to do. and pulling from other disciplines, right? I didn't know how to run a conference. And so I ran a conference closer to what I did know, which was the circus, than traditional HR or people operations or future of work conference. My very first venue, year one, the first annual responsive conference, was a children's science museum in the Berkeley Hills. It's called the Lawrence Hall of Science. It's a stunning venue. It's got 270-degree views of the whole entire bay. And it's got stomp rocket exhibits and a sand pit that mimics the San Andreas Fault in California. Years 2 and 3, we were at the Museum of the Moving Image in Queens, New York, which is 200 years history of film and photography. There's the Jim Henson, the creator of the Muppets, had an exhibit. There's the, actual cameras from 200 years ago on display for our attendees, even while there's all these things happening on the main stage. And so this year at Zappos, yes, we have Tony Hsieh on stage. We have John Bunch, who was a big part of the, Holacracy, has been at Zappos for 15 years. We have, heads of HR or leaders from Slack and Zoom Video and Reddit and GitHub and many others. But for me, it's a matter of, right, who is the DJ who's playing when you come in day one? What kind of food are we catering? We take an hour each day to have all 450 attendees break up into small groups of 10 people so that you're guaranteed when you come to Responsive Conference to interact with people who share common purpose and common passion around a topic of mutual interest. Because it's so easy to go to a large event and not really connect with anyone. I wanted to make sure that that connection happens. Yeah, it's not a typical conference because frankly, I'm not interested in going to an event where I listen to the sage on stage, as you say.
And for people who have never been to a responsive conference, people who may be holding out to the last minute, should I go, should I not go? What are some of the experiences and take-homes that you would hope a majority of attendees would walk away with?
Yeah. To me, the proudest moments come when I hear years later that, oh, I hired so-and-so, or I met my co-founder, or I started something that has then become a going concern, or I took a risk, right? Or you, Glenn, right? You attended last year and now run the Responsive Org webinar. It's a matter of as Tony Hsieh, famously says, it's the spontaneous connections that occur when people interact, and often interact unexpectedly face to face. There's so much more that can happen when a group of strangers with a shared purpose come together. And when I look at the state of the world today, that's what gives me hope, is whether we're talking about climate change or politics or any of the challenges facing the world today, it's when we bring a group of passionate people together, the magic that happens is way more than the sum of its parts.
And in addition to that magic, which I can attest to, you have curated and you have crafted a series of speakers. You mentioned one of the themes is parenthood at work. One of the underlying themes is the future of work. There is also, let me turn that into a question. Is there also skill building for people from HR, for people that are managers that they want to learn how to use some of these techniques? Is that built into this as well?
100%. Yeah. I give a lot of thought and now, right, several years on, I'm privileged to have a curation and experience design team that pays a lot of thought to the experience over the course of the 3 days. What is the flow from first coming onto campus until you leave? And so we have a number of themes. The overarching theme for Responsive Conference and, in my opinion, Responsive Org is the future of work. That is the broad theme. Within that, we're looking at remote work, parenthood at work. One of the topics we're leaning into this year is experimentation. Rachel Murch, who will probably be on stage, who's been at Zappos a long time, says, in talking about Zappos, that any of these topics, let's just say holacracy, Zappos is famously known for rolling out the system of self-management called holacracy, and got a lot of press, but also got a lot of flack for that implementation. Rachel said, yeah, we did holacracy. That was neither the beginning nor the end of Zappos experiments. Zappos is a 20-year-old company that has never stopped experimenting. And it's really common, there's the phrase fail fast and fail often in engineering. Like if we're experimenting with a new product or a new service in a company, of course you try a lot of things and you see what sticks. It's way less common or comfortable to think about experimentation when it comes to humans, when it comes to HR or org design or culture. The risks are substantially higher, and the perceived risks, both risks and perceived risks, are substantially higher. And so how do we make experimentation less taboo is a topic that we're leaning into in partnership with Zappos this year. And then in terms of tactics, a large part of the breakouts and the workshops are very, very tactical. We have the COO of the company Honey talking about this, hyper growth company, what he is doing at Honey to facilitate a culture of belonging. And to recruit and to retain top talent in LA and globally. We have a company, Clay, the co-founder of a company called Terminal, leading a workshop. I love it. It's the 140 steps to going remote. And it's just a very tactical step-by-step for any company that wants to go remote. And then even the parenthood is tactical too. We have the head of people at Reddit, former head of people at GitHub, Merit, 5 people in an interview in the round format. So the first person interviews the second person, the second interviews the third, until you get to the 5th interviewing the first person, talking about both personal and professional experiences with parenthood, right? So I'll never forget when we were talking to Merit, formerly of GitHub, for the first time, she very vulnerably shared, hey, I don't know how to talk to my professional peers. And if I'm misquoting Merit, I apologize, but I don't know how to talk to my professional peers who have known me in an HR capacity at, the biggest companies in the world, Kaiser and then GitHub, to say, I'm not sure yet if I'm ever going back to work because my kids are my priority, and how to make that socially acceptable in the workplace. Right? I think that there will probably be tears on and off stage during that parenthood interview in the round. And that's my goal, is to share that even these senior most people leaders who are implementing incredible and generous practices at Reddit, at Slack, at Zoom video, personally don't have all the answers, right? That these are not sages from the stage, but these are actual humans struggling with the same challenges that you and I might be, Glenn.
So the logistics of this, people if they want to find out more, the website is responsiveconference.com. So I'm going to differentiate. There's responsive.org, and there is a link to the responsive conference from responsive.org. The conference itself is responsiveconference.com. The dates, Robin?
September 12, 13, and 14. The conference itself runs over Friday and Saturday, the 13th and 14th. And then for folks who have registered, there are free workshops being offered throughout the day on September 12th.
Okay, and this, of course, is, for those who are not familiar with Zappos, this is in Las Vegas, and the conference itself will be hosted at their headquarters.
That's correct.
Okay, well, this is going to be delightful. Definitely looking forward to it. So let's let's backtrack a little bit and talk a little bit about a little bit more about responsive. You have described sort of being handed this baby and then everybody going off and doing their own the next steps in their careers. What do you see for the responsive community in terms of the work you are engaged in promoting and facilitating this learning, facilitating this sharing of questions together.
Totally. So speaking of proud moments from Responsive Conference, some of the things that have happened at the conference that I'm most thrilled by are the creation of community completely outside of the conference that occurred during and afterwards. So we have folks who are coming to the conference from Brazil, from Mexico, from Taipei, from all over the world. And that's from Australia. That's a huge honor. What's even more thrilling to me is when those folks go back out into the world and continue these conversations with their own community. So for example, out of Responsive 2017, we had somebody who went back to Arizona, and now there's an incredibly active community in, I believe it's Tucson, Arizona, listed on the responsive.org website, that they get together, I believe, quarterly, and many dozens of people get together on a quarterly basis, bring in speakers and run their own responsive.org events. Last year, Victor attended from Mexico, from Monterrey, Mexico, and turned around and ran his own responsive one-day event in Monterrey, Mexico, and invited me down to speak at it. I believe it was May of 2019. So as I've been able to grow in my ability to run events and my knowledge of running events, and now we have a full-time permanent team around the year producing Responsive Conference, we've invested a whole lot more in supporting the global community. And it's no longer just somebody is needed to update the website or accept people to the Facebook or LinkedIn groups. But we're really excited to announce, and I'll share it here for the first time, a new brand tied to the responsive.org movement of ResponsiveX, of community organized responsive events that are taking place around the world, and that my team is supporting the global community to run. So Victor, for example, will be announcing this on stage at Responsive Conference, but is running his own ResponsiveX Mexico City 2-day event in March of 2020. I won't give all the details away, but I'm supporting you, Glenn, in running your own ResponsiveX event in San Francisco in November of 2020.
2019.
Yeah. Sorry, 2019, November of 2019, just 2 months after Responsive Conference.
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Because the global community, right, running events is such an amazing way of bringing people together and providing value to attendees, hopefully providing value to the organizers, and maintaining a conversation that, in my opinion, is even more important now than it was in 2013 or 2014. And so giving that little extra nudge to community organizers around the world to move these conversations forward.
One of the things I was impressed when in some of our initial conversations before we set up this webinar series is how supportive you are of letting people who have an impetus to just come forward and act on it. So that's how this this webinar series came up, with Victor in Mexico City. How else, in addition to the one-on-one conferences, people can sign up for the mailing list, and then you send out events and things of this nature. How else do you see responsive.org supporting people's growth, supporting people who want to learn more, one of the conversations I have heard a lot, and you and I have been involved with some, is nobody around us is doing this stuff, and we want to know more about how do we create workplaces where people are healthier, where people are happier, where the management is responsible and responding to what's going on. Do you have other visions? Are there other steps in addition to the webinar series, the conferences, and now the ResponsiveX?
Totally. It's listening to the community and asking the community, what do you need? I've tried lots of things, and I've seen, DevOps is one community that I've watched closely as it's grown hugely over the last couple of years, the lean movement, the agile movement, et cetera. But I try to remain true myself to the responsive.org movement, right, as it was originally created by the founders, because ultimately, I'm a shepherd, not this is not something that, I own Responsive Conference, but like I remain a community member, and the community is much larger than the sum of its parts, or certainly than my sole contribution. Right? I could imagine a world, and it's an idealistic world, where when I walk into CVS or Whole Foods, the person behind the counter, I ask them how they're doing today, and they don't say, I'm really excited for when I get off work today, right? That's the highlight of my day. When we reach a world where people love their work, I'll go find a different event, or like this conversation won't be necessary anymore, right? But we have, all of us, everyone listening and everyone attending Responsive Conference and everyone who signed the Responsive Org Manifesto over the years has our work cut out for us, because we're a long way from that right now. If you want to see why this work is necessary, you just have to walk into any store and ask the person behind the counter how their day is. And, all over the world, it has been my experience that very often people are dissatisfied with the work that they spend the majority of their lives doing. And until we help those individuals both tactically, right, with like, cool, rather than be stuck in meetings, can we run the meeting more effectively? But also the true emotional impact of what is the work, Glenn, that you are uniquely well suited for, right? And how does an organization that you work for, or how do people in your life support you finding that work? Like those are the hard questions. I can teach anybody the logistics with Zoom video, but who are you and what is your purpose? That's the real work. And the most we can do for anybody is invite them towards doing that work themselves.
So if you're game, let's step into some discussion about the future of work and how some of these concepts fit in. Because I'm listening to you, and of course my work is very consistent in helping people develop their skill sets, helping organizations embrace employees. And the hard, cold reality is there's a lot of thankless tasks in work. I mean, you ran a coffee shop, washing the dishes and clearing the tables. There is an individual component where people learn to be mindful, learn to bring some sense of themselves into everything. But when I go out in the world and I look at what people do every day, I go, a lot of this, I'm glad you're doing it, because I would never want to do it. When we talk about creating healthier environments, we talk about more responsive types of work, how do you see the interplay between people's unique gifts, the responsibility of the organization to nurture that, versus the responsibility of a manager to support that? How do you see all of those, and then the need to make money, and then the need to do what the purpose of the organization is? How do you see evolving in the future of work? How do you see all those playing out together?
Yeah, it's a good question. Right? I don't own Robin's Cafe anymore. I set out to build an incredible company behind the counter, and did that, and ultimately found that, I was running an early responsive org event in San Francisco, out of a theater in the Mission District in San Francisco. The theater is owned by a 50-year-old nonprofit called ODC. I had lived in the neighborhood for 10 years at that point, and wanted coffee and tea for my attendees. It turned out that the coffee shop that was on site, the little corner store, the bodega that was on site, was shutting down just before this event that I was running. And so, dilettante that I was, I started a cafe on 3 weeks' notice to serve coffee and tea and sandwiches to my attendees. Ended up running probably hundreds of events out of that space over 3 years. And ultimately, last November, sold it because the tempo of running Robin's Cafe, even at a distance, even though I wasn't working behind the counter in the last 2 years, was so different from the strategy work that I really feel called to do, or running Responsive Conference, which was and remains really important to me. The tempo of being on calls with speakers and then getting a call from the cafe about some emergency that needed, resolution right then and there was too different. And there was a challenge there. But like, I think about it now, my current work is, as I say, I've been doing sort of strategy consulting for 10 years. And usually that would mean sitting down with, the CEO or the leader of an organization, thinking about the story that they're trying to tell, and then helping them find the resources to tell that story. Whether that's video or digital graphic design, building a personality sort of presence for that CEO, et cetera. Now I've taken a lot of those services internally and have a team of videographers, have the same production team that runs Responsive Conference, does a large number of other events throughout the year. But I'm thinking about the people I work with day in and day out now. So Willow and Angela and Jonathan and Nicole and, Laura, these folks that I've worked with for years and years, if all of them came to me tomorrow and said, hey, we think that we should be doing completely different work, and if we don't do that, we're going to quit, right? Like, Zander Media would probably do different work tomorrow. Right? Like, I literally have two choices. As the CEO, as the owner of this business, I could either listen to my people and go do what they suggest. If they said we should be we want to run a coffee shop, right? I could either go run a coffee shop with them, or I could fire all of them and go do the thing that I had set out to do, right? And of course, it's never that black and white, but like, that is ultimately any leader's choice, right? And if all of them, and I could obviously, right, it's never going to be that black and white, but I could try to persuade them, actually, we shouldn't own a cafe, or maybe we could do a cafe and do, video and event production for purpose-driven organizations, right? But like, it is a matter of that balance of like, I don't know what the right answer is for you, Glenn. I certainly don't know what the right answer is for, Simon Loudon, the president of Pepsi, whom I mentioned. But what is required, and I actually think what has always been required for leaders is listening to the people around us. And asking questions and being really curious and not thinking that we know all of the answers.
That's a key component that I've heard over and over again. You raise an interesting quandary for leaders today, which is maybe more true than it's ever been, which is you have the purpose of the organization, but in order to get people to be engaged, in order to retain top talent, you have to create an environment that people want to work in. And that was probably not true post-World War II. There are certainly examples of companies of that, but the whole employee-centric workplace is really a shift in terms of work paradigm. And I have seen a lot of managers and leaders get caught in that because they don't really know how to respond to that. And they grew up in a different generation, a different set of ethos, a different set of values, things of that nature. What do you see that encourages you about the future of work? And what do you see that concerns you?
The concern is easy. The concern is just the current state of the world, right? Like, my father's a biologist. I grew up doing a lot of environmental studies as a part of sort of his work. And when I look at something like climate change, like I hope that we, society, as a global society, will take the steps necessary to act in time for catastrophe to be averted. When I look at, and I'm in the United States, when I look at the current state of political tension in the world, there's so much animosity and a lack of listening. And I'm concerned about that. And I hope that we will get our act together in time to avoid crises. When I think about what gives me hope, all I have to do is look at my grandfather's generation, my father's generation, my generation, and my nephews. Right? My grandfather sold vacuums door to door and was an immigrant. My father built a company that was in an environmental consulting firm. and ultimately loved his work, loved doing much of the work itself, hated having employees. Some of my memories of my dad's job were like, he was such a perfectionist that he was resentful of having other people work for him because they never did as good a job as he did.
Right.
And then I look at my nephews who at 3 and 6 are being taught, like skills around communication that I feel like I started to develop in my late teens or early 20s at 3 years old or 6 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And granted, that's a, as we used to say in psychology, a man who story. That's a one specific example that is not necessarily, you can't necessarily extrapolate to the world as a large.
Right.
But the evolution of each generation, both about how we work and about how we communicate, how we listen, and the questions we ask. I'm really hopeful that, that my nephews are going to experience less bullying, that they're going to grow up in a world where more people love their work, where more people are skilled communicators, where more people are asking, what can I do to support?
And we're going to sidestep the entire question about AI because it's a little, that in itself is a topic for an entire evaluation. This has been very enlightening. I'm always impressed with your ability to hone in. Robin, how do people get a hold of you? If they have questions, if they have suggestions for something else they'd like to see occur in the responsive community, how do people get a hold of you?
Yep. So if you have feedback about responsive.org, go to responsive.org and there's a contact page. Feedback about responsive conference, that's responsiveconference.com. And again, a contact page. And for folks listening right now, I'll give out my personal email. I can't guarantee that I'm going to respond in the next 2 weeks because we have responsive around the corner. But that's Robin, ROBIN, at Zander Media, ZANDERMEDIA.com. And yeah, would love to hear from you. And then particularly in person, would love to spend time with anyone who is listening at Responsive Conference 2019, which is taking place September 12, 13, and 14 at Zappos in Las Vegas.
And for anybody who wants to get a hold of me, it's Glenn, GLENN, at 180, the number is 180circle.com. You can direct questions to me as well as to Robin about the responsive community. I have been quite impressed with Robin answering every one of his emails, of which you must have many and many and many, and how generous you are in inviting dialogue and supporting people. All right, any final thoughts that you'd like to share with people going forward in terms of either the conference or the responsive community?
Yeah, this work needs more people doing, showing up as their best selves. So that's my invitation, regardless of what that looks like, regardless of what that's called. How do you find a little bit more joy in your day? How do you find a little bit more joy in your work? How do you invite somebody, whether it's a stranger or somebody you've worked with for 10 years, to do a little bit more of their best work by showing up a little bit more as their best selves? That's the invitation, and that's what the world needs.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Robin. It's always a pleasure talking with you, and thank you for everybody for participating. We're always love comments and suggestions.
Thank you very much. A pleasure.
See you next week.